Marxism generates a lot of passion across the political spectrum. Considering the global influence of the ideas of Karl Marx, it's worth diving into the details that differentiate the words Marxist and Marxian to help ensure interlocutors are discussing the same thing. Here I give a linguistic analysis to unveil the reasons why an author chooses one word or the other. I'll start by looking at samples and opinions on the matter, and then see how they correspond to metadata using a corpus linguistics approach. Along the way, I'll search for the disciplines that Marxist and Marxian belong to. Namely, are they philosophy?
Why does Karl Marx get 2 adjectives? I ask because it's actually remarkable for a figure to get more than one. Simply put, Marxist and Marxian are adjective forms of the noun Marx, combining the noun with a standard suffix, much as we do with other words. When this happens to a figure's name, it's called an eponymous adjective. Other possible constructions could have been Marxite or Marxic. We see a sample of the dual nature of Marx's adjectives in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Louis Althusser, written by William Lewis, professor of philosophy at Skidmore College. The text explains how Althusser used Marx as a medium for his thoughts. This is especially true of the period between 1961 and 1966, when the majority of his published and unpublished work concerned itself with how to read Marx, the definition of Marxist philosophy, and how to understand and apply Marxian concepts. How to explain this casual shift from Marxist to Marxian within the same sentence? In order to answer that, I want to examine data on how writers have used these words. First, looking at the frequency of the 2 words over 20 years of the most recently available data on Google Books Ngram Viewer, we see that Marxist is used nearly 10 times more often than Marxian. While both terms' usage has declined by over 50% during this period, writers are still invoking the ideas of Marx more often than 3 other great thinkers, Confucius, Aristotle, and Plato.
Besides that Marxist and Marxian are highly frequent words, it's also remarkable that they both exist. In my study of over 500 eponymous adjectives of famous figures, I found very few who had multiple words. It's always Aristotelian, never Aristotelist.
To explain what I mean, here are some exceptions, with each figure's adjectives listed in order of frequency from top to bottom. That is, Trotskyist is more common than Trotskyite. This is a rare example wherein the usage may indicate whether you support or oppose him.
Avoid Marxism, or telling her you're a Trotskyite.
Trotskyist. Only a Stalinist would call a Trotskyist a Trotskyite, and I'm not a Trotskyist anymore. I'm a Maoist.
Right.
In other words, Trotskyite may be a pejorative, an attack word against Trotsky's ideas, while a Trotsky supporter is more likely to call themselves a Trotskyist. With Spinoza and Bacchus, on the other hand, it seems writers disagree on how to construct the word, which suffix to use, or whether to capitalize it. This may be an issue of phonology, where people disagree on the best sounding form. Personally, Spinozistic is not pleasing to my ear, even though it has long been the dominant variant. The fact that 3 other forms have survived this long is remarkable, but I haven't taken the time to look into it, so I'll leave that to your interpretation. Plato is indeed the great exception. Capitalized Platonic refers to his philosophy and maths, while lowercase Platonic refers to non-romantic love. The next 3 don't directly relate to him, but rather to Hellenistic thinkers in the centuries after him. But none of these is as widespread or controversial as the Marxist-Marxian distinction, so that is where I will focus. Before I began this project, my thoughts on the difference between Marxist and Marxian were something along these lines. Castro and Guevara were Marxists. Inspired by Marxist philosophy, they carried out the worker-led overthrow of the Batista regime in Cuba. They were doers. Meanwhile, figures from the Frankfurt School, such as Horkheimer and Adorno, were Marxians. They employed Marxian philosophy in their analysis of power struggles, but were unwilling to get directly involved in labor and social movements of the 1960s. They were thinkers, not doers. But maybe I'm wrong, and I want to know more, so I turned to Wikipedia. Browsing articles in the Marxism portal, I found a sentence in the introduction to Marxian economics, which draws a helpful distinction. Because one does not necessarily have to be politically Marxist to be economically Marxian, the two adjectives coexist in usage rather than being synonymous. They share a semantic field while also allowing connotative and denotative differences. Interesting to connect Marxist to politics and Marxian to economics, though overall this is a vague passage, likely the compromise of a wiki fight. Let's take a quick detour into the talk section to see how the sausage is made. Aha, we've got a quarrel. The first editor says, "Your opinion would not seem to be worth much, as you are a pushy troll with a superficial understanding." The reply, "Sticks and stones, Lycurgus." As you can see, this topic generates some strong feelings. Some forums have addressed this issue. What does Quora have to say about this? The top voted answer reads, "Typically, Marxist refers to Marx's political, economic, and philosophical ideas all together, while Marxian refers specifically to his economics, without going into his political ideas." Well, this is somewhat consistent with the Wikipedia excerpt. How about libcom.org, a left-leaning website? One relevant answer for us reads, "Marxists take Marx's writings and make an ideology out of it, i.e. Marxism. People who are influenced by Marx but don't do so sometimes claim to have a Marxian analysis." On the forum, this begged the question, okay, what's an ideology? Another poster said, "Marxians are those who don't fully want to commit." These comments seem closer to my conception of the Cuban revolutionaries versus the German ideologues. Let's see what the folks at Marxist.com are writing. Tellingly, they have a page on Marxist economics rather than Marxian. Further, we can see that on this page of summaries of economic analyses, the word Marxist occurs 30 times, while Marxian occurs 0 times. No, these leftists don't seem to have much need for the watered-down word Marxian.
So far, we've seen case studies that suggest Marxist is both a wide-ranging word that includes philosophy and politics, and also an ideology-charged call to action. Marxian has been labeled both an economic word and also a pejorative against those who adopt some of Marx's ideas but are not willing to wage class warfare.
At this point, I'd like to zoom out and look at larger trends from the Google Books database, accessible via Ngram Viewer. This is a huge corpus of over 200 billion words covering the dates of my study. Additionally, I have corroborated these data with those from 3 other megacorpora, British National Corpus, Corpus of Contemporary American English, and iWeb. You can access my work via the link in the description. With this search term, we can see the top 10 words that are described by Marxist. These are collocations known as dependencies. In addition, I've put the smoothing on 20, so we get a 21-year average, which is easy to work with. And we see, for example, that the phrases Marxist theory and Marxist-Leninist are used more than twice as often as the next words. Doing the same for Marxian yields the result that theory is used 3 times more often than the next word, analysis. Here is a cleaned version of the same data. The y-axis represents total usage. The higher the number, the more often it is printed in books, academic articles, and magazines. For example, Marxian theory is used slightly more than Marxist tradition. Collocations that are unique to their respective term are boxed in red. The fact that Leninist is unique to Marxist is consistent with the idea that Marxist is a political word. On the Marxian side, we also see consistency with some previous ideas. Both economics and socialism support the notion that Marxian is an economic word, though it is complicated because socialism is also political. But what is to be done with these other collocations? Can we make claims about the nature of Marxist or Marxian based on theory, analysis, or tradition, the top 3 words that describe both? Or that ideology and thought are disproportionately connected to Marxist, while concept and sense connect to Marxian?
Of course, I believe we can. That's why I'm making this video. But at this point, I need to address the question, was Marx a philosopher? Or, more important for our investigation, are the words Marxist and Marxian philosophical things? Thus far, we have seen cases of these words doing work in politics, economics, and philosophy.
Now let's see what the people think. The results of a 2005 vote for the greatest philosopher by listeners of In Our Time with Melvin Bragg on BBC4 says, yes, he's a philosopher. Marx got more than double the votes of the runner-up, David Hume, which actually made the host a little frustrated. He didn't seem to think Marx deserved it. And he's not alone. Listen to the opinion of Isaiah Berlin, a well-known liberal biographer of Marx.
There is, of course, one philosophy in the modern world which is perhaps the most widely influential and the most widely discussed in the world as a whole, and that is Marxism, which does tell people how to live and does give them a complete explanation of the world and of history and of life in general. Do you think that differentiates it from other kinds of philosophy?
It differentiates from other kinds of philosophy to this extent, that it isn't typically a philosophy at all. Marxism is a theory of history, and Marxism says we can explain the development of human society by, in a causal sort of way, by explaining how human beings developed as they have. There are certain laws, and when you grasp these laws, you will understand why things have happened as they have, why you are where you are on the social map, why you hold the ideas that you do, because perhaps you belong to a given class, and this particular class has the ideas it has because it is engaged in a struggle with certain other classes, and your ideas are in some way determined by your position in the class struggle. Now this is an empirical theory of history. They may pretend that it's something else, but it is actually an attempt to produce a science of human development, this is theology in fact, on a level with physics, chemistry, biology. I'm using different concepts, using different categories of course, but it's a science. And once you understand how human society develops, you will then be able better to operate, to live better, just as if you understand physics, if you know physics, if you understand chemistry, if you understand biology, you are better able to go about the universe without being a victim of unknown forces, which perhaps breed superstition and terror. This is what Marxism claims, but that's not its philosophical aspect. That is simply Marxism as an empirical theory of historical development.
Berlin provided a rejection of Marxism as philosophy, with the injection of Marxism as either history or sociology and empirical science. Next, we'll hear from Daniel Robinson, professor of psychology and philosophy at Oxford, who wasn't sure if he should include Marx in his Great Courses series, Great Ideas of Philosophy.
I've titled this lecture, Marxism, Dead but Not Forgotten. And I think here perhaps there are echoes somewhere within me of, an American boy of the 1950s discovering that if it's Marxism, it's bad and the like. It's very difficult to bring a balanced, entirely neutral perspective to bear on Karl Marx or Marxism. We do associate much of the second half of the 20th century politically with the writings and teachings of Karl Marx, and I think in this we probably either pay him much too much credit or we heap far too many libels on him. Much of what comes down to us as Marxism is by way of Mao Zedong and Lenin and Stalin and the like, and it matches up very, very poorly with things that Marx quite systematically developed in his writings. I'm also somewhat reluctant to talk about Karl Marx in a series of lectures titled Great Ideas in Philosophy, chiefly because Karl Marx was quite assiduous in declaring that he was not a philosopher. Indeed, he had a certain, well, I don't want to call it a contempt for philosophy, but he thought that philosophy had an expiration date on it.
Philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.
I included these analyses from academics to frame the interpretation of collocation data. We need to determine whether writers use Marxist or Marxian in a philosophical sense or for politics, economics, and, as Berlin pointed out, sociology.
Returning to our collocation charts, I claim that it's possible to classify these words based on other eponymous adjectives that describe them. That is, what kind of word is theory? Scientific? Philosophical? Political? We will start with the words that are shared between Marxist and Marxian. I have a list of more than 450 adjectives of people's names, with the nouns they describe. Here, I'm showing a sample of those that describe theory or theories. There are many, and it turns out that theory is quite a philosophical word, which surprised me. I had expected it would belong more to science or even politics, but the data show that the most likely discipline to use the word is philosophy, with examples like Lockean theory or Rawlsian theory. And that is followed by psychology and behavior, a category that also includes sociology. Examples are Freudian theory and Weberian theory. We also have representation in economics from Keynesian theory and Ricardian theory. The next high-frequency collocation is analysis. Indeed, it is philosophical, but it's more highly correlated to mathematics. The gray slice is populated by economics, not politics, while the psychology terms are often related to psychoanalysis. This suggests that analysis is usually empirical and less often philosophical. Tradition is used by many disciplines to indicate following those who came before you. The top-ranking philosophy, religion, and arts are not statistically different. However, tradition certainly is more philosophical than economic or psychological. In an academic context, which is what this data reflect, the noun view is a majority philosophical word, although it is also used by many other disciplines. Our final shared collocation is perspective, a very psychological and philosophical word. I see there is no escaping the philosophical nature of these words, even if they are not used primarily as philosophy when it comes to Marxist thought. But we can also not ignore the fair amount of politics, economics, and psychology, sociology. This mix may reflect the differing opinions of thinkers as to the diverse and wide-ranging legacy of Marx's impact. Let's now examine the unique collocations for insight into the difference between our two adjectives. Well, Leninist is undoubtedly a political word, and the data for ideology is no different. There are 0 instances of this word being described by philosophical or psychological thinkers. I have only limited data on thought, although it seems to be a predominantly philosophical word and secondarily political. Turning to the words unique to Marxian, concept and sense are majority philosophical words and partially psychological, sociological. There is very little politics economics on here, a strong suggestion that Marxian is not just an economic word. That is, the phrase, in a Marxian sense, is likely about his philosophy and not his economics. Looking one more time at the disciplinary profile of Marxist and Marxian, we see there's a fair amount of mix, with philosophy well represented in every term. But it is also important to look at philosophical collocations which are not usually described by Marx's adjectives. Compared to Marx's words, these three are more highly correlated to philosophy. And they feature in the profile of the quintessential philosopher, Immanuel Kant. These words, shown in order of frequency, are clearly more philosophical than those of Marx, with Marxian being slightly more philosophical than Marxist. This suggests that writers use Kantian in a stricter philosophical setting, while Marxist-Marxian is used in a wider variety. Now I'd like to explore another line of reasoning, historical data. In general, eponymous adjectives come into use around the time of the thinker's death, so let's look at the frequency in print of Marxist from 1883 to the most recently available data. The graph shows that Marxist didn't become highly used until the 1920s and 30s. How does this compare to Marxian? In contrast, we see that writers consistently preferred Marxian until it peaked in the late 1930s when Marxist became the overwhelmingly used adjective. Let's zoom in on this critical period from the Bolshevik Revolution to the year of Joseph Stalin's death, and compare these curves to other related adjectives. Starting with Leninist. Similar to Marxist, there is an increase in usage in the 1930s and a second bump in the late 1940s. The behavior of Stalinist also resembles that of Marxist. Finally, the lesser used Trotskyist also peaks at similar dates. These figures indicate that the use of Marxist was associated with Soviet politics and thinkers, and, from the 1960s, Maoists, all of which share the suffix "ist." Perhaps this is the group where Marxist should exist, rather than with the philosophers I showed at the beginning of the presentation. It is worth noting at this point that because of this connection, people who oppose communism are likely to use Marxist as a pejorative. Here's a nice example from Tomato Bubble, an anti-New World Order website.
Though Einstein's worshippers eagerly ate up his bull, astute observers such as the great satirist H.L. Mencken saw right through the Marxist clown.
Continuing, what would be the cohort for Marxian? I propose lightheartedly Keynesian and Ricardian for the economic work, Weberian for the sociology, and Hobbesian for its analysis of power dynamics. But in truth, I'm still not quite sure what to do with this word and how to classify it. The final element of analysis will be the suffix. Adjectives of philosophers are overwhelmingly formed with "an," which is unsurprising because this is the most common way to create all eponymous adjectives. Relevant for the present study is that 6% slice created with "ist." In fact, that 6% consists of only two words, neither of which are the dominant variant. Thomist for Aquinas and Platonist for the Hellenistic, Plato-like thinkers. There are several others whose usage was too low to be included in the study, but worth mentioning are Averroist and Moist. The top 4 suffixes for politics and economics are the same as those for philosophy, but the distribution is crucially different. Ist is a major way to create political adjectives. It seems ist adjectives tend to carry an ideology, the will to influence the actions and behavior of populations. Ist is overwhelmingly political. With the information now gathered, let's return to the entry on Althusser to try to make sense of the change.
This is especially true of the period between 1961 and 1966, when the majority of his published and unpublished work concerned itself with how to read Marx, the definition of Marxist philosophy, and how to understand and apply Marxian concepts. In addition, if we are to take Althusser's retrospective word for it, the pieces he published during this period were intended as political theoretical acts, polemics meant to respond to contemporary opinions and policies, and to shift the terms of these arguments as well as the actions which were their results.
Although Lewis describes philosophy with Marxist, which was not in the Ngram Viewer top 10 collocations, it's framed within political theory. I've established that Marxist is associated with ideology and the attempt to change the world, and this was Althusser's goal with his classic work. Furthermore, the author is active in critical theory, a Marxist-inspired field that blends philosophy and sociology. So I expect he is sympathetic to Marx, which is in line with our earlier notion from Marxist.com that advocates of the movement are more likely to use Marxist. Next, concepts was one of the collocations unique to Marxian in the Ngram data. And funny enough, concepts is more philosophical than philosophy. I believe the author here is differentiating between Marxist political philosophy as it had been transmitted and modified up to the 1960s, while Marxian concepts are more closely related to models, patterns of thought, and historiography outlined by Marx himself. In short, the author is using Marxist for the political movement and Marxian for the thinker.
Altogether, these arguments reveal the contested nature of both words, Marxist and Marxian. As one of the most influential and divisive thinkers in history, I suppose it's not surprising that Karl Marx has given us 2 of the eponymous adjectives that are hardest to classify and define. But this is what I can say. Marxist is chiefly about the communist and socialist political movements that have gained and lost adherents over the past century. But there is also a strong connection to sociology, in particular the branch that seeks to influence the behavior of studied populations. Plus, there is no escaping the fact that many writers use Marxist in a philosophical sense. Granted, it is likely to relate to political theory. Marxian is likely to be concerned with the man himself and his volumes of written material. The single largest branch appears to be economics, but writers who employ Marxian theories on power relations may very well believe they are discussing philosophy. Finally on my list is sociology, but perhaps history would have fit just as well. And this, dear viewer, is an example of what I've been doing with corpus linguistics for some years now. I'm not sure if it was the best use of my time, but I've mostly enjoyed it.